Hello everyone and welcome back to the next part of my Lore of Hydaelyn series, where we will be discussing the lore, history, and culture of the lands throughout the world of Final Fantasy XIV. And this is going to be part 2 of my 3-part videos describing the zones that are located on Vylbrand, in this case Noscea. Now last week we did talk a great deal about lower and middle parts of Noscea, but with so much information for each area, trying to cram them all into one video is very difficult, so I'm separating them into different sections. So this week we will be looking more into the lore and history of both Western Noscea and Eastern Noscea, as well as the residential district of the Mists. So I hope you're all looking forward to continuing our adventure across Noscea. Alright everyone, so this is the next part of Noscea, and we've already discussed it a great deal in length in my other video, so if you want to go and check that out, you can just go down to the description down below. It should take you right there. But just for a quick summary, Noscea is upon the Isle of Vylbrand, which is just off the shores of the main continent of Ardenog, and is separated from the rest of Eorzea by the Strait of Merthor. Now this week we're just going to jump right straight into the lore discussion, and we're going to be starting off with Eastern Noscea. Eastern Noscea is on the southeastern part of Vylbrand, and it stretches from Bloodshore on the sea to Raincatcher's Gully further inland. The region has a great diversity of terrains with pristine white sandy beaches to the east and dense jungles to the west. Probably one of the prettier locations in Vylbrand if you ask me, especially if you do go over to the more western part and you get to see more of a tropical rainforest. Now we'll be starting off with probably the biggest section that we have here, which is Bloodshore. Now, Bloodshore is on the very southern eastern part, and it's mostly the name of the white sands along the beach here. Bloodshore's name stems from a rather grim tale, because around 50 years ago there was a battle between the League of the Lost Bastards and the followers of Mistbeard, and it came off to a pretty gruesome battle just off the coast. When the smoke cleared, 4 galleys had been sunk, and there were hundreds of corpses in the water which had been swept away with the tides. The water and sand was soon stained red with their blood, hence the name Bloodshore. Ironically, this is also probably the nicest of the beaches that you'll probably find in Vylbrand, and especially after the resort was built there. Don't know why anyone would want to really build a resort where such a grim battle took place, but hey, that's not for me to decide. Anyway, let's have a closer look at some of the landmarks that we see around this area, including Gullbirch Tower. Now, one of 3 beacons that were built alongside Noscea's coast in the 6th Astral Era, this one here is located directly in the east, and its job, just like any other lighthouse, is to warn ships navigating the Strait of Merthor of its deadly shallows, while also serving as a watchtower for pirate and Sahagin raids on Bloodshore. But perhaps the most iconic location around these parts would probably be Costa del Sol. Now, though this area was originally cleared for farmland, it was abandoned upon the discovery that no crops would grow in the salt-ridden soil. It then caught the eye of Master Jijiriju, who was a wealthy Udon entrepreneur, who purchased the land and set about developing in the style of the southeastern islands. Jijiriju has not only altered the area's flora to match his taste, going as far as introducing species native to the more tropical climes such as Ciudalius, but also changed its name to Costa del Sol. So basically, this whole area here, everything you see that's part of Bloodshore belongs to this guy. And he's really not such a terrible guy. I mean, he's not, like, he doesn't try to stop us per se, but I'm just gonna come right out and say it and say that he's a disgusting lecher. I mean, Ladies, be careful around this guy. Next up, we have the Garlok's Lair. Now, this is actually a kind of interesting story behind the Garlok's Lair. Way back in 1.0, this was initially designed to become a dungeon one day, where we would be able to fight against the creature known as the Garlok. Now, sadly, we never got to see it because it was abandoned before that all happened. That was when Yoshi P took over. And there's no telling that it might become a dungeon someday. It's very unlikely. However, do not be so sad, everyone. It turns out that the Garlok is a rank S elite mark that you can find around Eastern La Noscea from time to time. So it turns out that they didn't get rid of it completely. I guess he just ended up leaving these caves. But as for the lore behind the Garlok's lair, intrigued by the monster known as the Garlok, that was said to live in the darkened cavern, Master Jijiriju sent a band of sellswords into the depths to find it. Not only are they rumored to have stumbled upon the legendary Fear Babe, but also stumbled into it, stirring the Garlok from its ages-long slumber. So, the reason it seems that the Garlok has awoken and is now roaming parts of Eastern La Noscea is because Jijiriju was curious about it and sent people in there which accidentally woke it up. So, way to go, Jijiriju! The next part we have is the Hidden Falls. Sheltered on three sides by towering cliffs, Hidden Falls can be found several score yalms upstream from where the Ageless River empties into the Strait of Mythol. Taken by its beauty, Udon bureaucrat Jijiriju was quick to purchase the land and construct a stage upon which private performances for the Mangate's favorite clients are held. So it's really because of how beautiful this particular area was that he wanted to buy this stretch of land and basically turned it into Costa del Sol. We don't really see him too often around this area, mostly because his estate is now so big, but we do see occasional people here, such as dancers who are practicing, and most especially we have Curious Gorge, who is, if you don't know yet, he's actually the one who teaches us to become the warrior after we decide to update it from the Marauders class. So he's basically our teacher in the beginning as well as a friend. And you can actually see him here, still training to this day. So, these areas that I just mentioned, these are the biggest landmarks that you'll see for Eastern La Noscea, at least in the southern reaches. Now, another interesting thing about Eastern La Noscea, aside from the fact that it actually has two different aetheryte crystals that you can use to teleport to and from, one of course will be in Costa del Sol, but the other part is more of the western part, which is in Wineport, which we will talk about in a moment. So everything that I mentioned so far, that can be found in the southern parts of Eastern La Noscea. The more western part, that's where we kind of leave the sandy beaches behind and we head more into like the tropical rainforest like I mentioned before. Now, we will start off here in Raincatcher Gully. Now, a great many plants blossom into crimson flowers within the warmth of this dense jungle, though scholars remain unsure of the causes behind such an imbalance in color amongst the region's flora. So yeah, compared to a lot of the rest of La Noscea, this here is perhaps the most colorful. It's bright, it's healthy, it's like a great big, beautiful tropical rainforest, and you would think that people would be more interested in this area. Unfortunately, that's not the case, because it turns out that this area is just a stone's throw away from an imperial castrum. But first we'll start off in this area which is known as the Raincatcher's Gully. Now, the biggest landmarks that you need to keep an eye on, we've got 4 in this area, one of which is Brayfox Longstop. Brayfox Altox is a former member of the Company of Heroes who sought to establish a camp in this region. However, she was unaware of the wounded worm slumbering in the cave deep within. Thus, the party of goblins she sent to the jungle met with great tragedy. So this is actually the location of one of the dungeons. This is a dungeon that you unlock shortly before you go on to face Titan. And it's really an interesting story because you're sent through this massive dungeon, probably one of the more of the bigger ones where you have actually a choice of how many monsters that you actually get to choose to fight. And you have your choice between either rescuing a bunch of these little gobbies and eventually you get to fight a giant dragon. And for perhaps I think a lot of people, this dragon is actually the first major dragon that you actually fight against. So I guess this was kind of a warm-up for Heavensward if you ask me. So apart from that dungeon, we also have several other locations which include the Severed String. Home to black marketers, the Severed String was also a shop dealing in smuggled and stolen goods until the owner abandoned it for reasons unknown. Though the place stood empty for a long while, at some point Imperial deserters took up residence within its amply named walls. So we actually do see this poor guy here. He turns out to be an Imperial deserter. So long story short, this poor guy was forced to join the Imperial army at, I'm guessing at a young age. He was taken away from his family, had no choice but to join them. I'm guessing that he comes from one of the provinces that was eventually conquered by Garlemald, and he was able to escape from them. He defected and he managed to make it here to Noscea. Unfortunately, because he deserted, there's no chance he'll ever be able to go back to it. I really do hope that we get to revisit this guy, maybe help him find his way home eventually. Maybe we can look more into that in the upcoming expansion of 6.0, where I'm all but sure that we will be going to Garlemald, but I've been proven wrong before. We also have the very pretty Red Mantis Falls, and it's named that because of the deadly red mantises that lay their eggs near the base of the majestic waterfalls, and probably the main reason why people choose not to live here. But yes, if you do ever want to get from the southern part of eastern Noscea to this more western part, you have to take the Raincatcher Gully docks. This ferry stops at these docks to take travelers from across the river, and a small storehouse nearby serves its porters and the steersmen. Of late though, rumors around the unscrupulous characters with a far eastern look to them entering with a shack. Yes, and that's not wrong. I mean, this is where you come to accept the ninja quest lines later on. After you make it up to being a level 30 rogue, you eventually come here, and that's where you meet your teacher, Oboro, who does teach you the ways of ninjutsu, as he continues to hunt down a nefarious foe who is hiding around in these parts. If you haven't done the ninja job questline yet, you really should. It's actually a really good story. So that's everything that is part of Raincatcher's Gully that you really need to keep an eye on. And for the most part, it's mostly uninhabited. Lurk around these parts, it's mostly left alone. That's not to say that this area is completely uninhabited. If we move up here to the Ageless Wise, which are ruins of an arcanic road, Ageless Wise's age is so great that some scholars even hypothesized that it was already old in the days of ancient Alum, so that's at least 3,000 years old. But here we actually have, I would say, two settlements. Well, we have one castrum and one official settlement. Wineport. Now, Wineport is blessed with fertile soil and groundwater rich in minerals. Wineport is a Lomensan village famous for its vineyards and its fine wines. The Bacchias grapes that they grow are known to be particularly famous as part of an exquisite wine. Though the village is not port in a traditional sense, its name diverges from its bustling trade. And while the settlement itself is not technically a port, because of all the wine that they sell, they decided to eventually give it the name of Wineport. Now, for the Bacchias grapevines, those were destroyed during the Calamity, at least for the most part. Thanks to the Warrior of Light going around to all these places and gathering up all these pieces of ingredients to hold a feast, which was surprisingly held in their honor, surprisingly we do eventually come across a cutting of the Bacchias vine, which we then bring back to Wineport, which pretty much brought back the Bacchias grapevine, so we can be expecting that in a few years' time. And finally, for perhaps the most dangerous part of eastern Noscea is Castrum Ocindians. Now, Castrum Ocindians was built by the 14th Imperial Legion in the 7th Umbral era, and its garrison to the 2nd cohort once under the command Ritanen Ses Arvina. The Garleans are said to have spent a great amount of time and effort examining the fragment of Dalamud's lodge beneath the stronghold, and that's actually quite important because eventually that helps open the way to continue down into the binding coils of Bahamut. So that there is everything that we know so far about eastern Noscea, and I personally have always really liked this area. I think it's probably the prettiest of all the places that we can go to in Noscea, and I'm always happy to see it. Alright, so now we'll be moving on to the second location that we're going to be talking about today, which is western Noscea. Now, western La Noscea is located in the southwest part of Vylbrand, and during the 6th Astral Era, this region was once a fertile land with a scattering of farmland that provided many of Limsa crops. After the Calamity, however, this place kind of fell to ruin, and with the Sahagin who bear down in the northwest posing a particular threat. Now, western La Noscea is separated into 4 different regions. We have Quarterstone, Halfstone, Skull Valley, and the Isles of Umbra. We'll start first with Quarterstone. Though 1 in 4 parts of Quarterstone soil is rock, this place was once known where golden wheat was abundant and thanks to the tireless toiling of its former residents. Now, however, the farmland is overgrown and wild, and the fields have stood stagnant ever since the farmers had to flee to Limsa in the wake of the Calamity. Now, there are 3 major landmarks to keep an eye on if you ever have to go through here, which you undoubtedly will have to someday, but one of which is Switch Perch, which is also where you can find the first of 2 different aetheryte crystals here. Now, Switch Perch is constructed as part of a great plan to rebuild the aetheryte camps, and Switch Perch is a new settlement constructed around the remains of a watchtower that once served the Yellowjackets. Farmers who lived in Cornerstone are slowly returning to this land, but their lives are very hard and the prospect looks pretty bleak, mostly because the landscape has changed so greatly that farming is very difficult, and you can't really build a prosperous life if there's really nothing growing in these regions. Not to mention that there is the whole matter of all the dodos that are wandering about, and the dodos aren't exactly known for making things any easier, especially if they're charging at you and attacking. And that's where we have the flock. This is a part of Quarterstone where farmers who once kept these dodos for meat and kind of like chickens, I suppose. I can only imagine the kind of eggs that they would lay. But after the Calamity, I'm guessing that they let their pet dodos run wild or they just escaped, and basically they reverted back to being feral. So this entire area is just flooded with dodos. You can find the ruins of old farmhouses and barns, and just like the barest trace of ruins of what was once a very healthy, very prosperous part of La Noscea. And it's sad to see that there's really nothing left growing in these regions. And really there's only one structure outside of Switch Perch that remains standing in this part of western La Noscea, and that is the Brewer's Beacon. This relatively new lighthouse was built soon after the Calamity claimed Switch Perch Tower to ensure safe passage for trade vessels carrying shipments of dark stouts and blonde berry wines out of Aleport. In addition, the Candlekeeps also maintain watch for increasingly frequent tidal waves caused by stirrings of the Lord of the Whirl, which is probably another reason why people don't tend to live around these parts, because there's a chance that you could be kidnapped by Sahagin and offered up to Leviathan as a sacrifice. When you put that all into consideration, you can't really blame people for not wanting to try to settle here. But the next part we're going to be talking about is Skull Valley, which is a little bit further to the western part. And in this area, it's a little bit safer because we have Aleport. As for Skull Valley itself, the name of this valley bespeaks a grisly history. When kobolds ventured down from Ogamoro, they were slaughtered by Yellowjackets, and their skulls were placed on display as a warning to others. However, with so many changes going on, this region is much more likely to see Sahagins than kobolds wandering about, but the name still remains, so it's not exactly the friendliest place you want to go and visit. Now, within Skull Valley, we have several different areas that are also kind of very important, at least to the storyline, such as Aleports. Now, this is by far the largest structure that you'll see, at least the largest structure that was built by Limsa. This here is another stronghold. It's a very successful port where you have people coming and going all the time, and it's also where the second aetheryte crystal that you'll find here. Now, unlike water, ale will not go stagnant on a long sea voyage. Thus, many ships put into this the second harbor of Vylbrand to fill out their holds with the stuff. Subsequently, Aleport does a goodly trade in grog, a trade encouraged by low taxes on various brews. What most people don't know, though, is that this was actually designed to prevent large vessels from clogging the port of Limsa, and that's actually a really good idea. So instead of having so many ships being crowded into Limsa's ports, they built aeroports kind of off to the side where you can dock your ships here and not have to worry about so many ships or getting into any accidents there. And of course, with a name like Aleport, how can any self-respecting pirate ever turn that down? So this is probably by far the safest stronghold that you'll find here in Western La Noscea, because not only do you have Yellow Jackets on watch, you also have Maelstrom members keeping a close watch here. Because without a doubt, the kobolds are the biggest problem that they have here on land. But when you go to the sea, that's definitely where they have the biggest problem with the Sahagin, and they have to contend with them on a daily basis to try to prevent them from summoning Leviathan. That's where we have the Shasata Sea Grout. Now, ages of pounding waves have worn away the sea cliff, leaving this natural cavern. While tales that the sea grout is a lair of deadly cohorts around, it has become that this is a ploy by the Serpent Reavers to keep people away. The cavern connects with the sea, and these pirates have built a hideout in its depths whence they aid the Sahagin. And this is actually a very important place here, because this is where we unlock our very first dungeon in the game. So if you're not familiar with this place yet, you clearly have not made it very far in the game yet. But this is actually a dungeon where it's infested with the Serpent Reavers, and once you go diving down into this place, the first half is actually more of the sea, of where you can clearly see where the Sahagin would kind of make their home. But once you reach the second part, that's where it becomes clear that you run off into more pirates than natural wildlife. We also have Camp Skull Valley. Now, a strategic outpost for the Maelstrom, Camp Skull Valley was once but a circle of tents occupied by a meager Yellow Jacket unit charged with surveilling the area for kobold insurgents. Those beastmen foolish enough to venture down from Ogomoro were slaughtered and beheaded, their skulls then put on display as a warning to others. So, of course, it would be named after Skull Valley. And I can just imagine it, like them sticking all these heads of dismembered kobolds around the area. Not a pleasant sight to see. Now, Camp Skull Valley has become a much better stronghold than in the olden days where they were just a circle of tents. This here is actually a real fortified stronghold, complete with like these great big stone walls, and we have Maelstrom members constantly on watch. On either side of that, we have both the north and south Tidegates. Taking advantage of the chaos left in the Calamity's wake, a large force of Sahagin rose from the sea and laid claim to Halfstone, a distant Lominsan settlement on the far western edge of La Noscea. To prevent any further swells of beastmen forces, though, a massive wall was erected between the enemy-occupied lowlands and the allied Skull Valley. So, these walls were not there before the Calamity. Once the Calamity came, that's when the Sahagin summoned Leviathan, who then kind of washed most of, which was once considered to be Halfstone, away. And this happened because the Sahagin lost all of their spawning grounds during the Calamity, and they needed new spawning grounds. So after the Calamity, Limsa was in bad shape, struggling to get back on their feet to try and recover from the damage, and then they had to contend with Leviathan being summoned, which then attacked Halfstone and washed away half the land, and what's left became a spawning ground for the Sahagin. Now, to prevent them from going any further inland, that's when they had the walls built up. So we have the north and south Tidegates. And that's where we have like all these guards on hand, like ready to fight them back if the Sahagin ever gets a little bit too, shall we say, curious about it, I guess you could say. Now, before the Calamity, in spite of the high rock content in the soil, people had to work very hard to turn Halfstone into farmland. However, after the Calamity was when Leviathan washed it all away, and it's now pretty much a barren stretch of rocky shore. This is mostly where you're going to find Sahagin in this area, and that's also where you can take on the Sahagin Beast Trap quests. Now, we have the Serpent's Tongue in this area, which is the hidden harbor, serves as a hideout for the Serpent Reavers, who have allied with the Sahagin against their fellow man. We have the Saspa spawning grounds, where the Sahagin swarm this area after the tidal had collided with the coast and are laboriously transforming it into the spawning grounds. We also have the Sahagin Landbase, which was built by warriors from the sea, and this landbase is actually allowed with the Sahagin to assault the Maelstrom station at North and South Tidegate time and time again. So this is where the Serpent Reavers, who are pirates who allied with the Sahagin, and so they have this special permission to build their whole little stronghold here, and they're allowed to be here in exchange for serving the Sahagin and Leviathan. There's also the Reef of Sending. Now, from the Reef of Sending, the Sahagin return the spirits of their brethren who perished on dry land to the embrace of the Azure Seas. So whenever a Sahagin, or at least somebody of great importance, dies on land, their weapons are brought back here in the hopes that their souls will find peace back in the sea. And finally, we have Nov's Nursery, and this is a very small beastman settlement where Clutch Father Nov raises his spawnlings alongside his Clutch. So, not all the Sahagin are bad. Like, this here is proof. I loved going through these beastman tribes with Nov. I just loved him. He was amazing. Now, as for Nov, he was once a pirate himself, and he had a very large grouping of eggs that was gifted to him by their queen. And so he was very proud of his entire clutch. But because of his actions as a pirate, one day when he left to continue his acts of piracy, people came to his spawning grounds and slaughtered all of his children in retaliation for all the things that he'd done. Only a few of the eggs ended up surviving the attack. And from then on, he forgo all acts of piracy, and instead, he's much more open to trying to negotiate with people. He doesn't want what happened to him to happen to anyone else. He wants to build a future for not only his children, but for their race in general. And thanks to him, there's actually some pretty good strides being made so far. And I just love coming to this area anyway. It's probably my favorite part here in Western La Noscea. And finally, we will be heading off to discuss very quickly the Isles of Umbra. Now, the Isles of Umbra, the seas off the coast of Aleport are bespeckled by small islands, which include both Moonshade Isle, which the Sahagin are basically using for kind of hunting grounds, but we also have the Isles of Umbra. Now, the Isles of Umbra, there's really not much to it. They're very, very small islands, and there's really only two landmarks that you even need to know about. One, of course, is the ship graveyard. Now, for centuries, ships wrecked off the coast of southern Vylbrand have been carried upon currents to this quiet inlet, a timeless reminder of how vicious the sea can be. There are just so many destroyed ships here that populate this watery lynch yard. It is said that for every hull visible above the waves, a score more slumber beneath it. So if you look around, there are no shortage of destroyed ships that you can find. Normally people would be wondering, why don't people come here and kind of salvage these ships and just build it from there instead of continuing to build brand new ships? Well, mostly because people don't like to recycle here, I suppose, but they really like something new and shiny. But also, it's kind of disrespectful because this place is really just one massive graveyard, not just for the ships, but for people who ended up dying at sea. And there are no shortage of those dead wandering about, as you can see here in all these live skeletons. However, the biggest structure, and probably the most impressive structure, which can be seen from moms around, not just from Western La Noscea, but in other different parts across La Noscea, is Pharaoh Sirius, which is the massive lighthouse. Pharaoh Sirius is a towering beacon built to guide ships safely into Aleport. Now, its fires were fueled by ethereal energy, which is a technology from Nauquiz and Vermil's, as radiant as it was innovative. During the calamity, however, some projectile struck the lighthouse and turned its ether inside into a great mass of corrupted crystal. So when you look at it and you see these giant orange shards of crystal protruding from the tower, that's all from Dalamud, when a tiny piece, I'm guessing, must have broken away from Dalamud and struck the tower. It kind of exploded outward, and that resulted in this crystal. So people have been forced to pretty much abandon Pharaoh Sirius, at least for the time being. We already have people who are going in trying to repair the damage, but that's probably not going to be for at least a good while yet. Now, the final area that we're going to talk about isn't really a zone, but I felt that it was worth talking about, and that is the Mist. Now, in order to be able to enter the Mist, you first have to accept the level 5 quest, which is called Where the Heart Is, Mist. And once you complete that, which you can accept in the Red Rooster Stead, which is in the Cedarwood in Lower La Noscea. Now, once you complete that, you will forever be able to enter the Mist either from the Red Rooster Stead or by taking the Lominson ferry docks near the Fisherman's Guild's lower decks. This here is player housing, so this is a quick glimpse of what kind of housing that there are, and it's perhaps one of the more popular of the housing areas. I mean, every area is quite popular when it comes to housing, but I think more people than anything are very interested in this because of the sandy beaches that we have. And if you're not able to afford a house, they do have the top mass, which is the apartment buildings that you can actually go to. Again, housing is kind of iffy these days because so many people do want housing. They want to come here, and now I was very lucky when I was able to get my own house, which they did expand upon in patch 3.3. And I originally came here first to be able to try and get my own personal house. I wasn't lucky, it was already filled up by that point. I was able to get one in the lavender beds, and I'll mention the lavender beds in future videos. But as for the Mist, it's a gorgeous area here, and hopefully if you are lucky enough to get a plot here, you have really nice neighbors. I mean, you never know in an area that is frequented by pirates. Alright, so that looks like pretty much everything that we need to know about both Western and Eastern La Noscea, as well as what we do know about the Mist, which really isn't too much more information that you can really know about the Mist except that it's player housing. So, what did you all think? Did you enjoy my video? I really hope you did, and yes, I know that we've been talking about La Noscea for some time now, but don't worry, next week is going to be our very last video about La Noscea. After that, we will be moving on to other locations, so we're either going to be heading off either to Gridania or Udal next. Which one would you like to hear about? I would love to know down below if you do have an opinion. And once we're done with the 3 city-states, we will be moving on to the other locations, such as Ishgard, Alamigo, Domo, anything that we can really find about those places, please let me know. I would love to hear about it, but anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll be seeing you all again next week with our final video where we are going to be discussing both Outer La Noscea, Upper La Noscea, and the Wolf's Den. So until then, everyone, thank you for watching. Hope you're staying safe out there, and hopefully quarantine is going to be ending soon. So until then, thank you, take care, bye-bye.